Well, thank you all for coming. Welcome to Moscow for so many of you who have traveled. It's always a privilege and a delight to have you here. One of the best things about it is being in a room full of so many women who have so many shared goals and so many, by default, shared difficulties. So many things that are common to all of us, and that's a tremendous blessing. I love speaking, well, I only speak to groups of women typically, but one of the things I love is how exponential women are, how each one of you here actually represents a lot of fruitfulness in other places, how it's a little headwaters of tons of homes, and how we continually are asking the Lord to bless the work of your hands. If you just look at this room, how much work is there for these hands that are here, that we're asking God to establish, to build Christian culture, and to let what we're doing here matter. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this shared goal of rebuilding Christian culture, and thank you for the encouragement that it is to all of us to be together pursuing Christ. As we approach this topic of giving and receiving, which is what my talk is supposed to be about, I think it's important to just start and get the most obvious out of the way first. There is not one of us here, or really in the whole world, who has not freely received gifts at an astonishing rate for our whole life. We are all receivers. Who earned our own creation or our own birth? Earned even one of our own breaths, earned a hair or a tooth. I mean, we haven't earned anything and we all have it. Our whole lives have been one continuous outpouring of gifts, and our natural sort of automatic default mode is receiving. We receive gifts always, constantly. What do we have that we have not received? And the answer is absolutely nothing. Everything has been received. What has even the poorest of us received from God? Overwhelming gifts. Your personal receiving department is hauling in gifts from God so fast that even when we stop to try to notice them, we get breathy and overwhelmed. Right? Like, I can't. I mean, we're taking in gifts and blessings at a rate that we don't have the capacity to notice almost. Our gratitude, when we really focus and we're like, let's get thankful, our gratitude is shallow and piddly and in no way corresponds to the reality of our lives, like the reality of the blessings God is pouring out. We receive blessings far more efficiently than we notice we are receiving blessings. We're finite and silly, and probably have gathered hundreds of us here this morning without any one of us having thanked God for the men who invented combustion engines, or the petroleum that is pumped out of the earth and refined to run them, or even the AC that kept it from being gross in the air situation in the car. We all rolled speedily over roads that thousands of someone else's figured out, while we were drinking our coffee made from beans from another country, roasted and brewed with water that won't kill you, that came easily out of the faucet. We've just been taking it all in. Some of us, probably many of us, took Advil without thanking God for it. We probably all ate things that we didn't even think about, didn't stop to gasp at the beauty of that strawberry we stuffed in our mouth while we were talking to someone. We didn't enjoy the beauty of the clean air in our lungs. And this whole time, we're all sitting here probably not taking a moment to notice the comfort that our shoes are providing, because we've never been without them or considered what that would be like. And I'm sure, going out on a limb, there's no medieval people here who had to go forage moss for cushioning in our shoes this morning. We're just taking in gifts all the time and not even noticing them. In fact, far from arriving here at the Nazarene Church in a cloud of grateful praise, it is more likely that we arrived here on a river of small complaints. We have gathered together with our troubles. When we see our friends, we want to update them on what isn't going well. These are, didn't sleep very well last night. First things first. First things first, I found something. We're all here with a bunch of bad hair days, suffering from static in pants that don't fit like we would like. With headaches we'd rather not have. We're so tuned into our sufferings, both big and little and trivial, and tuned out of our mercies. We've got our wavelength going for everything that is uncomfortable, and we're not noticing all of the gifts all of the time. And this is because we're such silly and frail creatures that we do not even have the bandwidth to absorb how much goodness is being poured out on us. All of our bandwidth is currently occupied thinking about our hangnails, our canker sores, and our favorite chapstick we lost somewhere. And of course, those are trivial examples. It might be something bigger that we're thinking about, but our bandwidth, I think of those, this is a terrible thing to compare a room full of ladies to, but you know those big crane flies or mosquito eaters that people call, with their really long legs, but they're hard to catch, but it's like, man, a puff of air and some of their legs fall off. It seems like that's about how resilient we are under hardship. And of course, beyond just this pile of physical riches that every one of us has received, is receiving constantly, we have also, as a gathering of saved Christian women, we have received also through no act of deserving a free gift of grace that totally dwarfs the physical blessings that we're receiving and ignoring all of the time. And this gift of grace is something that we may or may not think about in a day. It's a gift that is equally beyond our comprehension and is vast and constant. Constant gift to us. How much have you been forgiven? How much have you been spared? How many consequences of our own behavior has God in his great mercy taken from us? Why have we been given eyes to see, hearts to know God? Because God is merciful and gracious and full of love, and we deserve none of these things. And we're just weak trying to even comprehend the depth of his blessings to us. John Bradford in the 1500s famously looked on a person being taken to execution for murder and said, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." It's a very famous quote. You've heard it a lot of times, right? "There, but for the grace of God, go I." And that is spoken as a person who is actually tuned into this frequency that is this gift from God, like what God has given us. All of us here, I hope, know that we ought to be aware of what God is giving us. We know that. We have some kind of sense of our moral obligation of gratitude. But you all know, you're in Christian circles, you know how often people are resolving to be more grateful, trying to sit down to write out their gratitude. You have to actively think in terms of what am I receiving. But fundamentally, what is the difference between any of us and a woman who is prostituting herself for meth? Nothing but the grace of God. What is the difference between any of us and a woman who is climbing the corporate ladder, trying to build a career at Planned Parenthood on selling body parts of infants? Nothing but the grace of God is between us and that. That really is it. But just like we can get caught up in our woes instead of our mercies in our physical life, we tend to do this same thing in our spiritual life. We tend to ignore what actually we deserved, ignore what kinds of mercies are coming to us all the time, and focus on the trivial. What I want to draw our attention to today is a deeper level of receiving gifts from God. Nothing that I've said so far should come as any kind of a surprise to any of us. These are familiar things. But there is a way that Christians need to be open-hearted before the Lord, receiving what God is giving us. How do you say that our giving and receiving is really part of building Christian culture or rebuilding? We're all standing in the smoldering remains of a formerly Christian culture. We're all here. There's a lot of residual impact from the fact that we used to have these shared faith in our culture, and we don't now. So now we're here with all these smoldering ruins. And so when I'm talking about receiving gifts from God and the importance of, and this whole Femina conference about rebuilding Christian culture, I believe that open hands, open hearts, this freely giving, freely receiving is a really pivotal part of that, because I would say, it's pivotal because it's so fundamental in our relationship to God, to our awareness of the world, what he's created, and consequently how we relate to one another. We aren't even good at gladly receiving glad things from God, right? We're not good at gladly receiving joyful things, and yet every single one of us in this room has more than just glad things to be receiving from the Lord. We have hard providences and difficulties and health challenges and relational struggles. How are we doing at receiving those things from the Lord with open hands and glad hearts? How are we doing at that? Are we being consumed with self-pity, getting sucked into assorted victim identities, looking constantly through our files and memoirs of unfair things that we have suffered, constantly wanting to remind everyone around you of what you're going through, or here's this, or let me tell you about my grief, let me tell you about my burden. And this is just the reality. We're not good at this. We're not good at receiving happy things, and we're really not good at receiving difficulties from the Lord. And I think we're culturally not good at this because we no longer live in a culture that admires it. You'll hear people, probably conservatives will talk about, the greatest generation and their sense of duty and wanting to do their duty. And some of that was motivated by faith. And a lot of it was the fumes of Christian culture just carrying people along. Like, this is the way we do it because we admire, or the British, we admire the stiff upper lip, Culturally, we think that's neat, so we're trying to do it. But our culture doesn't admire that. How many Christian women are being invited into just the turmoil of self-pity all the time? Think of all of the horrible stuff you'll see directed towards moms, Mama, it's okay if you're snot crying in the pantry because you just don't want to deal with feeding the toddlers, whatever, the kind of support and encouragement to feel like we're victims in these situations. At times like this, we need to notice that we're standing in the ruins of a culture. And one of the reasons that it is the ruins of a culture is that individual Christians are not standing before the Lord with our hearts open, our hands open, and being willing to say with the prophet Isaiah, "Here I am, Lord, send me. Here I am, take me. Here I am." And so while I'm talking about open hands, I do want you to understand that this is a symbolic term in some way, but it's a practically symbolic term. It's something that I've reminded myself of many times in different circumstances and situations. This open-handedness is another way of saying being a living sacrifice, right? It's laying yourself out like, my hands are open, my life is yours, I am willing. Right? I'm willing to be a servant, whatever the Lord is asking me to do. Our hands are open to receive not just the blessings of God, but to receive His will for us, to receive trials, to receive difficulties. Our hands are open all the way to receive it from Him. When I say this, so think of open hands as being the posture of a living sacrifice. It's maybe shorthand for one of my other favorite images. I'm sure I've said this to you all. I know I've said it enough times in my life. A sacrificial lamb. You think I'm going to be a living sacrifice. Well, when a lamb was going to be sacrificed, the priest would take the hair on the back of their head, pull their neck back, like bare your neck to the knife, right? This willingness, Lord, take me. Willing, take me. Not like, no, Lord, no, I don't want, like, I will not be sacrificed. But we are not our own. We belong body and soul to the Lord Jesus. When our hands and our hearts are open towards Him, they are also necessarily open towards one another, right? We're necessarily, when we are right with God and our hands are open, it is a tremendous way to bring people together, right? If we're all oriented to God that way, we don't have nearly the shoving and pushing that happens so often among us down here. So as Christians, we are to be imitators of Christ. We're to follow in His footsteps. Now, really, the centerpiece of our faith, and actually the centerpiece of the entire cosmos, is the cross, right? The centerpiece of all of history, of the world, of creation, happened on the cross. It was a moment, and can't possibly say enough about this, but it was a moment in which Christ received what He did not want in order to receive what He did want, right? He received what He did not want to receive what He did want. Not my will, but your will be done. Not my will, but your will. He received the will of the Father for him. He received the wrath of the Father, and he received the nations for himself. He received it all together. But in each one of those instances where his hands were open before the Lord and he received what the Lord had for him, he also gave. He gave up his will in submitting to the Father. He gave up his fellowship and communion with God to take on our sin. Just note right there, that's what we gave. We contributed our sin to the situation. He gave up his life. The nations were present covenantally in this glorious moment, but the nations are made up of individuals. We all contributed sin to that moment. And Christ contributed on us his righteousness. What happened on the cross when God freely gave his son for us is that the Son freely gave his life. It's a ton of freely giving. The glory, the complexity, the mercy, the sacrifice, the joy, the gladness, the relief of what happened in the world, in the cosmos. At that moment, there really is no end to what was given and received in that world-bursting moment. And because Christ took our sin and gave us his righteousness, we are, by his overwhelming grace, brought into that moment, that communion with God, that rightness before him. With having brought our sin, having contributed our sin, we were welcomed to this unbelievable mercy. Working this glorious gift out in our lives, imitating Christ's willingness to give everything and receive everything is how individual Christians grow to be more like him. This is a posture that is like Christ. We open our hands up to God and we are willing. Not my will, but your will be done. Give, Lord, or take. Right? Open hands before the Lord. Give me this child. Take my selfishness. Give me a job. Take my self-importance. Take from me this child that you gave and give me your peace and grace. I'm not trying to make this sound easy. It's very simple, but it's very hard because we are, after all, a bunch of weaklings. It's very difficult, but it is beautiful and simple. We are shaped into the image of Christ through these moments. We are made to fit the building that he is building in plumb line with that cornerstone when we do this. We are made for our lives to actually mean something eternally when we live like this. And this may sound like I'm trying to have a big uber spiritual concept, but in reality, this is one of the most practical things to understand. It's probably one of the most practical principles that I have applied in my own life through years and years of things. I remember Blair, who's a teenager now, I remember her having a horrible case of the croup when she was a newborn, and that being one of the early times where I felt like she couldn't breathe. We ended up it was a big deal. Whatever. It was, and I was also very newly postpartum, so it may have been magnified by that. Hard to say, really. But I remember it actually being a moment where I prayed with my hands open. Lord, this is your child. This is not mine, and I'm not grabbing. I am holding her up to you, and I am willing. And it's an incredibly practical thing to use. It's an incredibly practical thing to think of that posture, knowing, am I receiving this from the Lord? All of us here want to build Christian culture, and so there are many things that we ought to do. Mom was talking about that. Things to do, run after his commands, like pursue beautiful things. And you've heard us talk about things, hospitality and laying beautiful tables and inviting people into your homes. And when we're asking him to use these things, this work of our hands to build his kingdom, we're asking him to use this little stuff to do something that's actually true, actually lasting, actually building an inheritance that isn't just in our home and at our tables. But in every, and this is why I say it's very practical, because in every deliberately sacrificial moment, you go out to honor the Lord with something, you're like, I'm just going to honor the Lord with this right now. And you go out there to do it. There will be a big chance for you to get grabby. It will be there. It will be present. to let your old heart slip out and start squeezing its little fists on everything. You're like, mine. You want to lay a beautiful table so that you can contribute to building Christian culture. And so you do it. You iron the napkins. You organize this whole thing. You make the flowers beautiful. I mean, you are going to bless people so hard, right? You were like, watch me go. I am pouring myself out in this. And if your hands are not open, you're thinking, I'm just going to bless everyone with this tremendous sacrificial love that I am showing them. And God will, I guarantee it, if your hands are open, he will find something to take out of them. And you can be surprised at what he finds. You think, oh, the Lord actually wanted me to be lifting up. No big deal about the big wine spill. No worries if you would like to scrape all the breading off of your chicken. Why though? Why? Why are you doing this? I hope we all have this experience. I'm not just letting you in on too much about myself. Or a guest that just doesn't notice at all that clearly you have poured yourself out and they genuinely could not care less, right? That just whatever. And what do you think? So if you had that incident, someone just makes a mess all over your beautiful moment of sacrificial love. What would you expect that to feel like? Because I guarantee you it feels like a spiritual version of somebody slapping your knuckles with a ruler, like a open. You realize, what was I even holding on to? What was this that this insults, that this hurts my feelings about this? We lift up our hands to the Lord to offer the work of our hands, and the Lord will absolutely take it. But he will also give to us in that moment. If your hands are not truly open, that it hurts when God is taking things out of your hands and putting things in it, right? It hurts, and it is like, that's not what I was trying to do. I was trying to honor God doing it this way, and I'm just so grieved because, whatever. And we turn it into a big drama instead of a very intimate and short relationship with the Lord. Oh, thank you, Lord, that I saw this thing. And immediately saying, it's your house, it's your food, it's your people. I don't care at all, but my hands are not in this. Right? I care because I'm trying, and I don't care what you want to put in or take out of my offering. And this is the thing. The posture of open hands allows us to offer everything freely and to receive everything freely at the same time. Receive what God wants to give you in this as you offer to him the best that you can. And he almost always chooses something that's better and wildly different than what we were thinking we were going to be offering, right? I remember one time that I was stressing out trying to get my house in order because someone was going to come over, but it was one of those times that had a lot of, everything seemed like it would be reasonable, and then it got really not reasonable, and then you're like, but I was going to bless her by, I was going to bless her. And I remember just a moment of being like, oh, Lord, open up my hands. Make this what she needs and not what I wanted to give. What I wanted to give has become irrelevant. What I was planning to bless her with, it's clear you're not in. So I will instead welcome her to this and whatever it is. That actual practical moment of opening your heart before the Lord, opening your hands and asking him to give and take from your hands, asking him to take what he can. The more that we do this, the more that we're really shaped by that awareness of what God is taking and what he is putting in. It is a very intimate way to walk with God. You see him challenging you in places repeatedly. You see him giving you trials, and you think he must want me to learn something about this particular thing. So I don't want to make you think, because there's a real segment of the population that loves to fall into the kind of hyper-spiritual trap of saying, see, none of this really matters. There was no reason for you to ever try to do a napkin because it's only about the spiritual thing. But you should always be suspicious of that. It doesn't matter, because really, what does that eliminate from the equation other than your work, your good works? I'm just going to sit here and not do anything nice for people, and that will be more spiritual. Be suspicious of that. Don't fall into that and think, oh, it's not worth pursuing. Now, the reason that we ought to do this and the reason that we ought to offer things to the Lord is because he glorifies that. When we offer it to him, he takes it, he glorifies it, he establishes it into something far more real than anything that's happening right here and on this plane. He makes it so much more. So it's not a situation of only the spiritual matters, so why would I bother with the things here on earth? Instead, we have to see that God gave us all of these real and true and glorious opportunities, spiritual opportunities, through the world that we're in now. If you never cared about a tablecloth in the first place, you would never have to see how grabby your heart can be about that. You would never have to see that there's a way in which you need to be more like Christ, that this is an area in which I need to grow. 2 Corinthians 4:17. This is just such a beautiful comfort. And don't think that I think that stained tablecloths are the biggest affliction. Just getting that out there. 2 Corinthians 4:17. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. When we live open-handedly before the Lord with all of our efforts, he is glorifying our work by building something permanent and glorious and heavy and fixed. He's doing something with us that we can't see here very clearly. We get little glimpses of it. Now, I hope that you can see the areas in your own life in which you need to be more open-handed. I think we all have them. Maybe you have been, certainly there are people in this room who have been longing for a baby, and the Lord gave, but then the Lord took. Are you acting like the only thing happening is here and now? You with your empty arms and a broken heart. Like, are you acting like that's all you believe in? That if you don't get the baby right here, that nothing glorious and permanent and spiritual is happening somewhere else? But there is something beautiful happening elsewhere, glorious and weighty. Trust the Lord. Open your hands. Live like a Christian before the Lord with your heart and your hands open. Our children are his. Our lives are his. Our homes are his. Our money is his. Live willingly and freely before him, and you will be living in a far realer world than this one, using the things around you to glorify God as he builds something permanent. Prepare yourself for the reality that as we grow up, so do our opportunities to trust the Lord. So do it, like, as the older we get, it doesn't get less reasons to trust the Lord. It gets more reasons. You may think it was hard to have children, and you probably haven't thought about them growing up and leaving. That moment where all of a sudden you're like, I've been sacrificing this way, and now I want, everything in me wants to clutch, right? Grab onto this and refuse to give it up. Like, I was going to glorify God so hard with these little kids that I don't want adults to glorify God. Having open hands before the Lord means that our husbands, our children, our friends can trust us because we're not grasping after them with white knuckles, right? There's peace and safety in that. The direct relationship to the Lord that shapes us. It shapes us into something that can be built together, that can stay together, because it pulls our gaze upward and outward. It's tying us to each other with God's bonds instead of our own. We're not trying to make our kids stay with us with traditions or make our kids stay with us. We're offering everything freely to God, and he ties these things together. So often we are confused when things that we know to be good are hard. Isn't that funny? It's always a remarkable thing, but we're confused when we're trying to do something beautiful and faithful and we don't feel beautiful about it. It doesn't feel super glorious. Like when we see someone else being faithful, we imagine that feels amazing, feels so good. But when we try to do it, this doesn't feel good. Like, who can I talk to about the fact that it's actually not easy for me to have a lot of kids in my house that are like messing everything up? It's like, wait, I must have a special circumstance because I actually, for me, getting old is a little difficult. So, like we end up thinking we have some special situation that no one else has experienced before. But walking faithfully with God is actually just difficult, right? And I mean difficult, not that it's by our own work, but that the fact that it's hard means literally nothing about whether you're doing the right thing or not, right? If you know you're walking with the Lord, you're offering it to him, expect it to be hard. And just because it is hard does not mean it's wrong. Nothing is necessarily wrong with your effort at hospitality. I liked that Mom said we're not supposed to be living a spiritual roller coaster when I'd already put this in my talk, that your hospitality felt like a breathtaking spiritual roller coaster through vistas you'd never imagined. Where, like, I never saw this coming, never imagined a world in which this could happen. There are always times that the human heart is ready to pop out and be ugly at stuff. And what a gift the opportunities are that make us see that in ourselves, that make us see how ugly that is, or what thing I need to not be holding on to. When what are now my 5 teenagers were basically 5 babies, I saw things in my heart that I had no idea could live there. Horrifying things, guys, shocking things, selfish, grabby, petty, angry, fearful, and ridiculous things. And I only saw them for the first time because God was taking them from me, right? Why did I see that? Because the Lord was like, give me that, Rachel, I have better for you. And you're like, well, why am I holding that in the first place? I didn't know that I had this in me. And whenever that springs up again, give it to God again with an open hand, ready to receive great blessings in its place. When we want to grieve, sort of, about how hard motherhood is or how hard this whatever is, you're showing that you're not looking, like you don't want to open your hands enough to let God bless that obedience. Like when you just say, Lord, take that from me, like take it, whatever it takes, root out this selfishness. I want that gone. If you're clutching after things and being like, but it's just so hard and it's just so difficult and whatever, you're probably not opening your hands enough for him to pour out on you the unbelievable blessing of that willingness before him. That, Lord, take it, whatever it is. You don't want to be full of unbelief about how God blesses obedience and willingness before him. Hardship here on earth is not the same thing as hardship forever or ultimately. So back to our weak frames, which I want to put in parentheses here, the Lord understands and has compassion for. It's not like we all need to gin up the stronger frame to not be human. He understands the weakness of our frame, and yet he commands us to this kind of obedience. We tend to grieve our difficulties, like miscarriages, like health problems, because we are little. We can't see it all yet. We can't see what God is making with this. But ultimately, all of that wrongness here, if it is right with God, if you're right with God, that wrongness that is here is ultimately right. It's ultimately not wrong. He does all things well, right? So that grief that you have has to be dealt with and felt and experienced in the context of trust in God and knowing that he does all things well. That's what Mom's saying, rebuke yourself, right? Be the person who can say, I'm grieving because I lost this, because this hurts, but God does all things well and I trust him and my life is his and my hands are open. We can be at peace in his peace. He is actually really, truly present with us. It's not an imaginary thing. He's actually present with you. He can be trusted entirely. So we can be at peace in his peace, keeping our hearts and our hands open before him. Now, we desperately need this perspective because we don't actually, I'm not telling you, trust the Lord so you won't have difficulties. Right? That is actually not one of the paths that we can choose. You can trust the Lord with your difficulties, or you cannot trust the Lord with your difficulties. But the path is your difficulties. Okay? Like that's what we have. So there is a good way to do this, and there is a bad way to do this. But there's no way to not do this. There's no, I choose the option where we skip all this part. Remember the book of James. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. I love this because he's saying, do you lack wisdom? Ask God. He will be happy to give you wisdom. And how will he give you wisdom? He will give it to you by giving you various trials through which you will learn to trust him. Because what he's giving you, that wisdom and that peace and that faith in him, is the gift that he gives you through trials, where you're willing, where you're receiving from him what he is giving you. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. We could say, based on the image I'm using in this talk, he who clutches after things in trials, like he who's doing this, that's doubt, right? That's doubt that God can't be trusted with this child, with this problem. God can't be trusted with my physical body and my health or my home or our money, like, Lord, I don't want to give it to him, can God not be trusted with what he has given you? It's doubting God when we are afraid to open up our grasp on things. It says, for let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. Don't suppose that you will receive anything from the Lord if you were double-minded, unstable in all your ways. That pretending to be lifting something up to God while I just realized I'm kind of imitating this little. Mom specifically told me she wanted me to hit that pose, and I didn't mean to, but then I did. But open your hands. Yeah, see? Open hands. But that's doubt. These little fists of I am the only one who knows how this should go. I don't trust God with this. I don't trust this to be his world, his story, and how he is doing it. The more we practice this in petty little things, just like practicing gratitude, the more we have confidence that this is the world we're living in. This is the world where God can be trusted. Our eyes are opened to that different reality. Our eyes are open to the fact that this is right. All is well. God can be trusted. He's doing what he wants to do. And he, by his amazing grace to us, is using our lives for that. What a gift that our meager offerings can be part of something glorious. I want to close going back to that reflection. John Bradford saying, there but for the grace of God go I. He was looking out at someone going to be executed for sin. And he was talking about sin and separation from God. He was not talking about difficulty and struggle or even death, right? He wasn't saying there but for the grace of God go I, because that looks difficult and I expect it to be a breeze, what I'm doing. And how do we know this? How can I say this for sure about John Bradford? Well, it's because he was a man who had eyes to see the grace of God, whose hands were open before the Lord. In the early 1500s, John was studying law at Cambridge when he was converted to Protestant Christianity, and he immediately began a study of theology instead. He became a pastor. He traveled around preaching. He was known, and not in derision, as Holy Bradford, because the love of God for others was so manifest in his life. It's visible. But as soon as Mary Tudor came to the throne, he was arrested on trumped-up charges, spent 2 years in prison, some of the time in the same cell with Latimer and Ridley, and where they studied the New Testament together and wrote things and were so productive. I don't know when he said this, there but for the grace of God go I, but it could easily have been through the prison window. There he was where people would be executed. That's where he was. When John Bradford was publicly and shamefully executed for heresy, burned at the stake, it was 4 a.m, when a large crowd had gathered to witness it, many of them his friends and sympathizers. So this man who said, there in this public execution, but for the grace of God, go I, was publicly executed, burned at the stake. A lot of people gathered around to watch. Nothing could be wronger or more right at the same time. Well, yes, it could, the cross. But what I mean is, you think of him dying for what he believed, dying for the truth, and it was so wrong. The situation is so wrong. Bloody Mary was so in sin. So many people it was such a mess. So many things that needed to be straightened out. And yet it was eternally right and glorious and kingdom building that he was faithful in that he walked with God in that. After being tied to the stake, John apparently cheerful to the end, asked anyone there who he may have offended for forgiveness and freely offered his forgiveness to any who had wronged him while tied to the stake, and then turned to the young man who was with him, also being burned at the stake, John Leaf, and said, "Be of good comfort, brother, for we shall have a merry supper with the Lord tonight." There, in the grace of God, go I. Here in the same difficult situation, but in God's grace. This is beautiful and glorious and wonderful. And here we are hundreds of years later, still being encouraged by that, right? Still thinking what a wonderful thing that is. An observer who I think was a friend of his wrote that he endured the flames as though it was a wind on a hot summer's day. Just at peace, happy, joyful, going like a man on his way to a dinner party in lovely weather. Like, well, I'm off, here I go. And we think that God's grace is not sufficient to carry us through a miscarriage, to carry us through singleness when we didn't want it. And you say, oh, the Lord can't do this. He can't carry me joyfully and at peace through something like this. Instead, you should be able to say, whatever the situation God has put around me, whatever the trials, whatever he is giving, here in the grace of God am I. Here I am, Lord. Burn me up. Here I am, Lord. Send me. Use me. Do whatever it is it takes for your name to be glorified and for me to honor you. There is far more for all of us to give God than we can imagine. And there's far more that he will do that is wonderful and eternal and glorious with that. We just have to get our grabby little hands and hearts out of the way. We have to submit them to him and really say, not my will, but your will be done. And Lord, give me the grace to do this. Give me the grace. And if your hands are open, I guarantee you they will be filled with his grace. Ephesians 3:20 through 21. Now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us, to him be glory in the church by Christ Jesus to all generations, forever and ever, and amen.